Albert Travers. When the knock on the door arrived, it was 9:30 in the morning, and it came as no surprise that the woman knocking should be the post lady, or lady of the post, as sometimes she was called. It was around such a time every day that letters, at least for the wealthiest of the villagers, or rather the noblemen, did arrive. Neefus was one such nobleman, of course, and he did receive his letter that day. It was not from Mr. Recumulus, and received well it was not. He wondered for but a moment as the lady of the post handed him his letter, who the letter was indeed from, but it was soon clarified. The letter from the post office, said the lady of the post. We would like it if you would not respond to this letter, she also noted, and then added, we are sorry for the village's loss, and I do hope that you did not lose in the wake of such events. Neefus said nothing, but simply took the letter and returned inside, and then to his room. Hastily, once he had entered, he opened it, and it read, The village has lost a kind and gracious woman, the Mrs. Lilith of the Travers family, honorary member of the Fine Metals Company. Neefus skipped through part of the letter which simply noted that the woman's few accomplishments and mentioned the rest of her family, who now live on without her, etc., etc. Neefus was not interested in this, but he wanted to know something else. Who had killed her? Why? Eventually, searching the letter, he found no conclusion to his question. Frustrated, he crumpled the letter up and tossed it into the bin inside his room. Neefus, methodical now, had recognized the name of the company in the letter, and in fact he knew the husband of the woman, making him wish he had feigned interest in the woman's passing, as she had lied dying or dead on the street. His name was Albert Travers, her husband, and he had been the finest blacksmith in the country, or so the people did dictate. He had made his way up in the formation of his company, which had been done in a vague and obscure fashion, leaving Neefus to wonder, did that have anything to do with his wife's death? Most importantly, however, who had done it? As well, he had prayed that after Mrs. within the letter it would have said Gwyneth, though obviously it had not, unfortunately. He knew it hadn't been her, after all, as he would have noticed straight away, but yet he had hoped for it. Perhaps he did not want to go through with this, after all. But no, he had to. Of course he had to. Gritting his teeth now, he unclenched and, letting out a long sigh, rubbed his temples and decided that he would take a trip to Albert's house. It was just across town. Besides, he yet awaited the Mr. Recumulus letter. Why should he not continue in the meantime? Decidedly, he would do so. He was a nervous man, Neefus was. Perhaps that was obvious to those around him, or perhaps he seemed simply happy to them. He was always smiling, always trying to please. In fact, if it had not been for the Mrs. Gwyneth, he would have nothing. If it had not been for her father, rather, as he was the one who chose him to be her husband. He saw promise, he had said, but Neefus knew that what he actually thought was that Neefus was easy to manipulate. He had figured that much out, Neefus had, and when the old man had passed away, it had been obvious enough. This was Gwyneth's company and not his own. Still, he had some part in it, and he could downplay his somewhat pointless role in the company to Albert, whom it did not concern, and whom it did turn out was himself somewhat less useless. As Neefus approached Albert Travers' home, a small mansion on top of a hill at the base of the crest there, he noticed that, with a sort of melancholy and a lack of concern for himself, that there was a large dog ahead on the other side of a large iron-wrought fence surrounding the mansion. His sadness, however, was soon replaced by a very potent feeling of fear, something that he often felt and which motivated him greatly, obviously. As he approached the dog, of course, it began to bark and run towards him, making Neefus jump a little. It was tied to a leash, and he had nothing to worry about, no, but of course Neefus was a man for which fear was a great motivator. And rage, he had much rage. Albert, however, would see none of that, and Neefus, who knew the man only little, knew intuitively that what he must do is to make the man feel large. He was not a large man, Albert, after all. Perhaps not short or small, as burly as he was, and of great strength, but tall he was not. Neefus knew this, and given his background as a blacksmith, and the man was about 45 years old. Neefus knew that it would be right to assume that he perhaps wished himself larger. After all, when you come from such a lowly place where fighting is commonplace, or more so, much more so than where Neefus had grown up and now lived, the threat of combat surely was always there, so size is something the man probably wished he had more of. Besides, didn't every short man wish that he were taller? Neefus smiled to himself a moment. Of course they did. So he would make him feel large, and then he would ask him about his wife, and surely he would be grief-stricken. Easily enough, he would snake his way through to what the man wanted in order to gain information that perhaps could aid him in his own intentions. Neefus checked the lock to the gate. There was none. Hesitantly, given the rabid dog, which looked as if it hadn't seen a meal in some days, it was that ravenous, Neefus opened it slowly. Its creak was audible and distinctly loud, which caused the dog to bark even more. Nonetheless, Neefus walked up to the front door of the mansion, a large wooden door standing before he and Albert Travers, and information that could potentially aid him in discovering a way in which he might commit his deed, so to speak. In truth, what Neefus hoped to find here, in this place, he was uncertain, but perhaps at the very least he would find out some information about the family here, for when the Mrs. Gwyneth was dead, he would have to run the Darkwoods Company alone, something that he wasn't accustomed to, but which he could surely do. Simply put, nobody had ever given him the chance, but given the chance, he knew with his intellect he could do well. Also, the man from the other night, the Mrs. Company. Neefus had discovered a thing or two of the man. After sending the letter, he had made sure to research who the man had been. He gathered from some of the townsfolk that he was a young entrepreneur, come to introduce new ideas and concepts to the community. It hadn't been long before Neefus had realized, of course, that the man was simply sleeping with the Mrs. Gwyneth in order to gain access to her company, to then strong-arm more than likely the Mr. Accumulus into giving up more of his company so that he could benefit. What they planned to do with him, with Neefus dared not think of. They had a dark history, the Obscurus family. That was the surname of the family of the Mrs. Gwyneth. The Romulus family, contrarily, Neefus family, had been somewhat of a goody two-shoes, a family which did not break any rules and which actually profited much from not doing so, as one might know that their business was a practical one. They sold tools simply enough and had a smaller business which they used to help to build houses, of course, on Recumulus or Obscurus property, but many families had that privilege, and his was not the only. Why Gwyneth's father had chosen him for marriage, he could not be totally certain, but at the time he had been glad, and probably it was because he was so easily manipulated as a young man. Obviously this was not so anymore, or so he thought of himself so highly. The company names of the Romulus family were trusted tools and other such metalworks. And the great builders of Osai, Neefus' hometown, city rather, he did miss them, but as he thought, he found practical use in his family history. Perhaps even he could use this familiarity with metals, though he had never worked the floor of any of their factories, of course, to ease his way into Albert Travers' pockets, so to speak, or into the wealth of knowledge which he surely had of his wife's untimely death. That, coupled perhaps with a compliment of the man's strength and valor, would surely, he thought, grant him access to such information, which decidedly may lead him to his wife's killer, which then might, if he were lucky, aid him in the killing of his own wife, somehow. And as Neefus was certain that Albert had nothing to do with the death of his wife, he had a feeling that one thing leading to another, if he did this right, that this would lead him somewhere from where he could or might benefit. Nonetheless, Neefus continued on, walking up to the dusty mansion and knocking solemnly on its ironclad door.